So the way I wanted to work it was that the bit that we've just seen was supposed to be kind of like an opening statement about animal rights, vegan movements, animal welfare, animal advocacy as a case study, which will interweave in the course. And then this is the opening statement about social movement theory. Now, what you'll probably see then is you'll see how the two things match. And when we go through this bit in particular, there's probably lots of it that you'll recognise as animal advocates. And you'll recognise it on an organisational level, but you'll also recognise it on an individual level as we go through. Okay, so major developments then in the way that social movements have been theorised or written about. The early theories were often called collective action theories, and they were largely very negative in character. For example, the early theorists of social movements, or mobs, or riff-raff theories, some of them were called, assumed that the fact that someone took part in protest, or the fact that someone went to a demonstration, showed that there was something wrong with them. Okay, so if you were a demonstrator, there was a pathological problem with you. Okay, so this comes from adhering to a social theoretical model, which basically says that society has got mechanisms within it, which means that when it gets out of kilter or out of equilibrium, these mechanisms bring it back into balance or equilibrium. So in that model, there's no real room for social movements, okay, because it's got a self-correction element to it. What we'll see as we progress is that there was a paradigm shift in the way that social movements were thought about and analysed. Certainly in the 1960s, we can obviously think about the birth of second wave feminism, the civil rights movement, and everything else that went on there, the students' movement. This kind of changed everything. Now, one thing it changed was that sociologists themselves got involved in protest movements. And so that means then that the theories that they had hitherto adhered to themselves and been dominant within their field were telling them that they were pathological, right? And so this kind of their own participation gave the lie to those theories that they thought. It could no longer be the case, they thought, that being involved in a social movement meant that you were an irrational individual. They said, well, I'm not irrational, I'm involved, so there must be something wrong with the theory. So, if you were involved in social movement activity, you were suffering from essentially some pathological problem that could no longer be right. And so, out go the old theories, and in come new theories. New theories were required, and surprise, surprise, these new theories found that social movement activists were perfectly rational, they were normal people, and moreover, they had genuine grievances, which society wasn't taking care of. Okay?
This was in the 60s.
60s and 70s, yes, that's right. Yeah. Now, it should be said, and we see this, that this development, this change, wasn't universally met with praise, especially, we might say, from the political right, because the idea of being able to label a group of people as irrational was quite useful, but also, more surprisingly perhaps, some people on the radical left were also very critical. Now, that comes in when we start to learn about new social movements. We'll skip that for now. Okay, so it should be noted then that social movement theorists have moved on from the crude ideas about social movements and the people who protest in them, but, and this is a very important point for us, this does not mean that those negative stereotypes have been eradicated from society, And so if you're wondering why people say, get a job or get a life, often there's something about that. And in fact, the article that you posted, Frank, said that, the 8-year-old, right, says exactly that point. Yeah, so that was quite interesting to me. A further development found that not only were modern social movements and their campaigners perfectly rational, they were pretty organised too. So that led to a whole field of analysis, especially in North America, about organisation, about resources, about mobilisation of resources, and that usually comes under the banner of resource mobilisation theory. So we'll kind of touch on that a little bit. Another development, this time associated with European theorists rather than North American ones, started to concentrate on social movements by seeing them as communities, or as little societies, or even imagined communities and societies. And now we've got the notion of virtual communities and virtual societies. Societies or communities that can be made up of people who don't really know each other as individuals. So obviously, the first thing we're going to think of is the internet and the way that people interact on the internet. They don't know each other, but there's kind of feminists who do that, there's anti-capitalists who do that, there's obviously animal advocates who do that. Recent social theory may also see activists engaged in an identity involving, but also an identity transforming phenomenon. And this is quite interesting for us because this is suggesting that when people get involved in social movements, it has a big impact on them. And a lot of people do say that anecdotally. They say that, you know, by me getting involved with that, you know, I've found a new bunch of friends or a new bunch of colleagues, but it's also pulled me away from my old friends and colleagues and maybe even the family. So it does tend to kind of transform you a little bit, and there's quite a lot on that, and that's quite an interesting thing. These later theories then correspond much more with how social movement participants and activists see themselves and what they say about themselves. Obviously they see themselves as acting rationally, and they see themselves on some level as organising. They might not see themselves as in an organisation, especially not if that organisation is like a business or like a commercial firm. They will probably shy away from that maybe, but recognise that some organisation is necessary. When it comes to seeing themselves as acting rationally, as might be expected, movements and the counter-movements often level the charge of irrationality at each other. There's almost like a childish kind of bantering that goes on between social movements and counter-movements and counter-movement people. And again, we can see this very clearly. You just have to look on Facebook. The first thing that happens, you know, is that people start screaming at hunters, and hunters start screaming at them, and they're basically saying, you know, you're just a bunch of lunatics and all the rest of it. And so there's no real engagement about the ideas. It just tends to kind of be thrown back to those early things, saying that irrationality is involved. So when we're dealing with modern theories about social movements, then we're involved with new social movements. What we'll do in this kind of mini course, if you like, is talk a little bit and briefly about the difference between old social movements and new ones. But we don't have to go into that too deeply, but we will look at that to some degree. A very recent way of characterising some social movements is by thinking of them as tribes. And in fact, some movements themselves, and at least some people within those movements, tend to describe themselves as members of tribes. And perhaps the best known example, at least the best known example to me, is from the early 1990s and the so-called Donga tribe. Now the Donga tribe effectively formulated the Rhodes protest movement in the UK in the early 1990s. So these were the people who virtually kind of set up villages and towns in woods and forests that were going to be knocked down for building new motorways. And they would build tree houses, they would have walkways between them, they would almost like have an entire kind of community there. They would dig into the ground and lay concrete and cover it over so they could lock themselves on and everything. And so it was just a way that they saw as kind of protecting the earth by actually being in contact with it and stopping the actual diggers and work people doing their job by chaining themselves to their equipment and that kind of stuff. So that's called the Donga tribe, Rhodes Protest. And seen obviously as a tribe. Now, in some of the theories, some groups are described as tribes, which we might find quite surprising. For example, the United States gun lobby is sometimes described as a tribe within some of this theorizing. So not all of it would necessarily kind of resonate with us, I don't think. Some recent theories have suggested that a movement such as New Age travellers can be seen as a hybrid phenomenon, and that involves a mixture of things like lifestyle issues, subcultural values, and the notion of being in a movement. So, about 1996 through to 1997, when I was doing my MA at Bangor University, myself and a colleague, for our dissertation, we looked at the advent of the so-called New Age traveller. And we did find some of these different elements in it. For example, there were some people who were deadly serious about being New Age travellers. They suggested that the way they lived was a social protest in and of itself, and a major way of protecting the environment. I clearly remember one person being interviewed on the TV, and the interviewer said, "Well, is it true then that your lifestyle is so kind of basic and crude that when you go to the toilet, you walk into the woods, dig a hole, go to the toilet, and cover it over?" And the guy said, "Well, yes." He said, as opposed to going to the toilet and flushing it to my nearest pleasure beach, which is worse, kind of thing. So some people were deadly serious about it. Others were less serious, and they maybe travel just in the summer months, and then they will return to their squats and in Manchester and everything for the winter time. Get the old central heating on, that kind of thing. And then some of them were just really into the image and the clothing. Yeah. And so we ended up, and perhaps this is quite unkind, talking about the latter people. We call them false travellers, because they didn't do any travelling, and they didn't do anything apart from dressing up in the gear, I think. So that's the way it worked. So these developments, the ones that I've outlined, these shifts, have also followed a pattern which is prevalent in sociology in general. So we're talking about the so-called cultural turn in sociology. The reason this is relevant is because the stress of the cultural turn obviously is on the cultural aspects of society. This is a move away from kind of Marxian, Marxist, economic and materialist analysis, and a move towards more micro-analysis, looking at the particular. So Johnson and Clandemans, you all know your reading list, they explain that social movements are part of society, and yet, as we've said or suggested, they are a challenge to that society too, at least potentially. At least the new social movements can be seen as a challenge, but maybe just to one part of society. So there we see the difference between old and new, in the sense that the old social movements tended to want to take over the state and change everything, whereas new social movements tend to focus on one particular aspect of society. Societies themselves are cultural, and although there's a great deal of dispute about the term cultural, it's one of the most difficult words to define sociologically. What we're talking about are ideas to do with things like customs and beliefs, and this list here, like values, and also artifacts, symbols, and rituals. So Johnson and Clandiman are saying that cultural analysis moves us away from notions of organisations, or resources, structures, and preconditions. They say that theoretically that's looking backwards, back into the kind of 70s and Marxian ideas, and ahead are the messier insider kind of analysis, looking for perhaps softer factors, as they put it, which means mental and subjective factors that go on in social movements, and also the relationships that go on in social movements. The problem for that, as I kind of alluded to before, is that for the researcher, this is quite difficult to research when you're dealing with these kind of issues. The technical term in academia is to say we need to operationalise your research, which means you've got to find a way of measuring variables and this kind of thing. it's quite difficult when you're just talking about subjective values, rather than kind of hard economics or structures, that kind of stuff. So all of this is also about the notion of stasis and change. In sociology in general, we tend to look for those patterns, continuity and change. And that's really the basis of society. It's kind of thing, everything is changing, but everything remains the same. That's kind of what it means. That there are structural elements of society that keep everything fairly rigid, but everything also changes as well. It's a little bit like you can change the entire staff of an institution, and yet the institution will remain pretty much the same. Yeah? So stasis and change. Recent analysis suggests then that any particular dominant culture in a society is not as stable as it first seems. And that's good news for social movement participants, because that means that change is possible. I love it when you go to Dundrum and you pay for your parking. The little sign comes up that says change is possible. I think that's brilliant. I always thought that was great. So change is possible. Things are not as fixed as they might seem. From a distance, societies look very stable. And therefore, a macro, a wide, overarching analysis might suggest stability. Apart from revolutions, or when we're in a kind of pre-revolutionary state, cultures tend to change slowly. It's like a form of evolution, and it often takes a great deal of time. However, social movements are particularly unstable. Movement itself is the metaphor. And so people have theorized that if you're going to get change in society, social movements are very important in that sense, because this is where the kind of mix comes, where the new ideas come, they develop, they flower, and then they spread into the rest of society. So from a distance, social values, social norms, social codes appear stable and also perhaps widely accepted. And there's a concept in sociology called a value consensus. If you've got a value consensus in society, most people go with the same set of values. Closer up, when you look closer at things, the notion of consensus is much harder to see. Close up, society is full of what Johnson and Clandemans call cracks and fissures, little cracks in society. The macro view, the wide overall view, renders these invisible, but closer up these cracks can be seen. So this view suggests that social movements themselves, but particularly social movement activity, is useful to investigate this notion of social stasis and change. And why? Precisely because social movements are seen as part of society, but also, as we said, often a challenge to it. They are the fundamental source of change. Social movements, therefore, should be the centre of sociology, because they are central, social movements are central to new social politics and new realignments. So these are quite big claims being made for the social role of social movements. Now this comes from the work of Alan Serain, as you see there, but this echoes quite a lot of what Jürgen Habermas would say, which is that social movements in society are very crucial, not least because they ask questions, they demand answers to questions, and so therefore they're very important. So, this cultural analysis is focused on notions like cultural performance, which sometimes reveal this kind of close-up picture, this picture of society which is riddled with gaps, and riddled with inconsistencies, and riddled with contradictions. And the idea is that the activity of social movements can create a set of alternative values. And so some are given here, like in terms of symbols. The hippies or the yippies brought a load of new kind of symbols in, not least the CND symbol and Make Love Not War, these kind of ideas. Languages change as societies develop, and social movements have a role there. Rap music is given there, Rastafarian movement would come in there. And in terms of code, you can think of the punks. So the question for us then, taking interest in social movements, are these the seeds of change that we might like to see, or at least some kind of disruption, some turbulence in society? Because, you know, does that mean then that you know, things are getting a bit shaken up? The more critical thing to say about that is that rather than being seeds of change, what we might see is for these new developments to become taken up by the system. So the system tackles it by incorporating it, emasculates it, commodifies it. So these alternative structures become in some ways bought off. Now, one example we used to give about this, I don't know whether you experienced this yourself, but in the 1970s when the punk movement started, especially in London, what punks would do, going to a gig, would be to buy a roll of bin bags and make their t-shirts out of bin bags. They would just punch a hole in the top and their arms would come through the sides, and that was their t-shirt for the night. Okay? And obviously it was quite useful for all the spit and everything that went on. However, within months, Carnaby Street was selling tailored bin bag tops. Yeah. And so that again is the way that the system can try to kind of buy off.
Yeah, I think it was Leonard Cohen who said the 60s lasted for 5 minutes before the Huxleys moved in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so suddenly you get the thing, and then you know suddenly you'll find some capitalists selling back to you your own values that should, in theory, be oppositional to them, but it doesn't quite work that way. Okay, Johnson and Clandemans, for their part, are saying that social movements can arise from these social cracks, if you like. Another important part...
Can I just ask a question? Are you assuming that a social movement is contrary to capitalism?
I'm not, no, and that would also not fit in with that first definition either, because if you got a movement which was contrary, you'd probably get a counter movement which, yeah, so no, it's not that. I mean, there's some interesting debate in the animal movement at the moment about whether you have to be opposed to capitalism to get what we want. And, you know, David Nybert would say that, Steve Best would say that. A lot of other people say, no, we can have, you know, we can have an animal-free capitalism, or a green capitalism. Other people say that the actual structure of capitalism is just impossible. I think, I mean, I imagine that creates quite a lot of interesting dialogue within Marxist circles, because a kind of crude Marxist position would say that society is pretty kind of rigid, and that capitalism itself is caught up with the contradiction of capitalism. Whereas what we've learned recently, and what the critical theorists and everything did, was they tried to figure out how it turned out that capitalism was much more flexible and subtle than Marx thought it was, you know. And you could be cynical and think, well, it's a few crumbs from the top table, you know, or you can just say that capitalism has turned out to be quite a flexible system and not rigid at all. So does that open up the door for a green capitalism? Is it possible? So some people would, yeah, so that'd be an interesting argument. I'd like to see how the Marxists would talk that one through, really. What Johnson and Clandemans are saying is that this idea of processing culture is very important. You might arise from these kind of cracks in social values, but also there's a question of processing culture or asking critical questions about it. The result of that is the creation of subcultures and countercultures. Counterculture being the more important one in terms of bringing about real change. Again, going back to the idea of could the system buy you off, a subculture probably would be a lot easier to buy off than a counterculture. So that would be interesting. So they're suggesting that these social movements consume culture and then they remodel it and they transmute it by adding things, changing things, reconstructing things and reformulating things in terms of their own values. So in terms of looking at or theorising social movements, it's difficult, at least should be by now I think, difficult to see much of this from the outside. This means that insider research is very interesting from a methodological point of view and perhaps essential. this is another general kind of sociological problem about the fact that the social scientist is also part of society. So how can they best look at society? Do they do it as insiders, with all the baggage, or do they try and make themselves strangers to their own society and look from the outside? There's a lot of argument about that. What's probably true is that if you're inside a movement, you're going to see a lot more, and probably know a lot more, than any outside observer. At the same time, the outside observer has got that splendid isolation which that kind of objective position is supposed to create. So, in some senses, you might argue that some kind of methodological kind of pluralism and mixing would be quite good there, and you need to look at the literature and see how that would come about. In this course, I think we'll probably end up talking about the inner life of social movements, because we're looking at social movements in a theoretical sense, but also as participants in social movements. Looking at social movements like that has been seen as quite boring. I'm just going to sip of this before I lose my voice. And you say, wait, try that again. I had to get some bleach on this before. Looking at social movements from the inside can seem rather boring. What's really meant by that is that some people think of social movements as being very active, doing things, changing things, revolutionary and all this kind of stuff. Then you look inside a social movement and you see people attending meetings, addressing envelopes, or used to be, and maybe selling sales goods or giving away badges. So this is often dealt with by a concept called goal displacement. Okay, last one, which is good because I'm losing my voice here. This is more positive, maybe. The inner life of a social movement can be seen in terms of its idioculture. Now, idioculture comes from the work of Gary Fine, which is interesting because he was taking a kind of micro view when the dominant paradigm was to look at kind of Marxist macro kind of thing. But essentially, he was saying idioculture is a system of knowledge, beliefs, behaviour, and customs. And the suggestion is that these are interactively shared by social group members. This analysis then reflects what someone like Zygmunt Bauman would say about social life generally. In that, it's claimed that members of society have a reality, experiential reality, which is based on the fact that they're attached to groups, and being in a group is very important for people as social animals. And so the same is said about social movements, that there is a certain experiential reality about being in a social movement, and part of it is their attachment to a group. And this is where that idea of transforming comes in quite interesting, because eventually you kind of identify with your group and you split away from everyone else, and so that's where you get ideas like, vegan sexual and this kind of stuff, and, do you have any friends who are meat eaters, and, when you talk to a meat eater, you end up having all those kind of group kind of discussions about your interaction with the general mainstream, because you've kind of, you come together as a group. Suggested then that one member's experience is understood by other members, fairly kind of conventional idea, that they have tools in which to shape and construct social reality based on shared values, and quite understandably, a movement's culture will bring it together, and that means that it gives it cohesion and necessarily distinguishes insiders and outsiders. So again, that's the third different use of this notion of insiders and outsiders. The extent of a movement's idioculture is ultimately, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, ultimately connected with factors that determine how long the group will last, how stable it will be, and how kind of intense it will be in terms of its interaction. So that's a kind of breaking the ice on the theoretical side of things, and then from now on I think what we'll do is, when we have our next session, is we'll delve a little bit more into some of the detail going back to the collective action thing, and that goes back to the kind of 1930s, and then we'll rush up to the 1960s, and we'll see that big change. So we should get to that in the second one. So that's about it for, anybody want to make any comments, ask any
I just
questions?
want to ask a question about, like, is there like a, seems to be like the animal protection movement, is there a name that is commonly acknowledged for, you know, it's not the animal rights movement, it's not...
The most common name is the animal rights movement, even though it's misnamed by that. There's a minority of people who agree with that animals have got rights in the sense that it's laid out in the philosophy of animal rights. But it's a bit messy because, you know, a lot of people go, yeah, I believe that, you know, animals have got rights, and then there's a problem then because, you know, are you talking about negative rights or positive rights, which again comes back to the counter movements, or are you talking about moral rights or legal rights? A lot of people who misunderstand the movement think that it's based on legal rights and bringing about legislation or bringing the idea of you know, animals as persons, making them legal persons in a sense. Whereas someone like Tom Reagan would say that it's almost exclusively theorising about moral rights, you know. And what tends to happen there is that moral rights become codified into law, and then they become legal rights. So that's how it changes. But the point is, if you focus on legal rights, that puts you straight into the political system, which, as I said, a lot of rights people reject, because they think that we're not going to get very far until we've had cultural change first. Yeah. Otherwise, I saw this on Facebook today. Mike Huskinson, well-known anti-blood sports guy in England, he was saying, you know, the police are not acting, you know, they're not enforcing the hunting ban. We've got to do something about it. The real problem with this is that the hunting ban was brought in by speciesists in a deeply speciesist society. We're now expecting speciesists in a deeply speciesist society to police the hunting ban and to arrest people who break the law, you know. But the actual culture goes against us, you know. If we haven't brought about any cultural change, we've got more of a problem, because they don't see it as being that important. Well, that's about animals, you know. I mean, you can see police officers going, I've got better things to do than chase around the country.
The hunting ban wasn't really about animals, it was about Tories and the class system in England.
Yeah, some of it was, and the debate about it was quite interesting, because animal rights was never mentioned. It was all about pest control, animal welfare, you know, land management, this kind of stuff. The concept of animal rights, you know, philosophical animal rights, didn't come into it. I mean, I was in England in those days and took part in loads of debates, including TV things, and animal rights didn't come into it. It wasn't part of it, you know. I mean, the guy who proposed it in England, he was a guy who went fishing. You know, he proposed the ban. You know? So, I mean, this is the problem. You know, animal advocates can have a real problem if they try, if you like, too early to get involved with the political system, which is deeply speciesist. And often what will happen, and this is quite an interesting thing that happens across the board, is animal rights gets translated into animal welfare. Example of that is circuses. You go outside a circus and you go, elephants have rights, you know, animals have rights on that. They'll come out and go, our animals are well cared for, the ISPCA have been and they've inspected the place and they think it's grand. And you go, I didn't say anything about welfare, I said animal rights. But it gets translated into animal welfare, because that's really the only language that they can understand. The same goes for the political system. You talk to the political system about animal rights, it gets translated into animal welfare, because you can't get animal rights through the political system that we've got now, because it's too speciesist. You just get little bits and pieces, which are usually rubbish, because they've been put together by speciesists in the first place. It's been argued through by, you know, through that culture, and you end up with kind of stuff that's hardly worth, you know, the paper it's written on. And then, because the culture's not changed, the people who are now banned do all they can to overturn it or to get around it. So in England, they found every loophole possible by which to continue hunting. You know, it's said, I know some people would dispute this, it's said that more foxes now are being killed in England than before the hunt ban, because you can still kill them. It was never, you know, the hunt ban was never about not killing foxes. There's another thing about it. You know, It was about how you kill foxes. But even now, you can still set a pack onto a fox,
Well,
so long as you don't kill the fox.
I mean, you're differentiating clearly, obviously, between the welfares and the rights movement. But would you not say that there is some trajectory, perhaps, that would you might see the animal welfare movement as a precursor to the animal rights movement, and often within radical movements, going back obviously to the original, kind of Menshevik Bolshevik split, the most conflict is often at the fringe of a movement. Between people who are
from the outside, you can't tell the difference.
Yeah. So it can become like a kind of quite self-destructive thing when the sort of when there's a conflict between the welfares. I don't know.
Well, I mean that's an interesting one because in modern advocacy, this is kind of being known as kind of foot in the door type stuff now. In other words, it's a little bit like get somebody to go meat free on a Monday. That's the foot in the door, and it could lead to vegetarianism, which could lead to veganism.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of incremental thing.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody expects incrementalism, and so therefore a lot of people do say that it's just a continuum. And if you think of a spectrum, you can get animal rights at one end, you can get animal welfare and meat-free Monday or whatever here, and you can kind of nudge people along to it. Now there are other people like Francione who would say that there are practical but also theoretical problems with that. Is the fact that they kind of contradict each other. In the sense that when you're working for animal welfare, you're kind of bolstering the entire paradigm which sees other animals as property, sees them as being part of the
but at least you're in a situation where there's you're raising the awareness.
That's the argument against Francione. What you say is that there are some people in society who have not thought morally about other animals at all.
Exactly, which is probably kind of the modernists.
Yeah, that's right. And so if you can get them to think on any level about it, then that's the foot in the door thing again. And we've talked about cracks. I mean that's
sure, and that's probably where a lot of people